Today's show is brought to you by The Voice That Is. TVTI offers personalized service and has carefully selected some of the finest brands in the world, each offering exceptional quality, performance, value, and above all, musicality. Doug White is the premium dealer for Tidal Audio and a trusted dealer for a refined selection of high-fidelity brands, including Antipodes, Bel Canto Black, Bricasti Design, Dynamic Design, Skograd, TW Acoustic, Vimberg, Zesto, and more. Check out this award-winning dealer and the products he represents at TheVoiceThatIs.com. That's www.TheVoiceThatIs.com. Season 2, Episode 3. Rock and roll, folks. Thanks for joining us on the occasional podcast. We are fresh back from Rocky Mountain Audio Fest. If you want to see the highlights from that show, just check out the previous episode with none other than Scott Hull of Part-Time Audiophile. Kind of helps me highlight all the great stuff we saw from that show. However, if you're listening to this live, we're also heading to another audio show because that's kind of our thing. So we're heading to Capitol Audio Fest at the Hilton, Washington, D.C. Rockville Hotel Executive Meeting Center. And today's sponsor of this episode, The Voice That Is, Doug White, will also be there, and he would like you guys to know that he will be in the Walnut Room with the new Vimberg Mino speaker, M-I-N-O. So stop by, say hi, tell him the occasional podcast sent you, and shake that man's hand, because he's great, and he always has really top-flight stuff at the show anyways. Sit down for a listen. Always a good time.
The two Bryans here, Hunter and Beasley. How you guys doing?
Hey. But Hunter and Beasley, together again.
Together again. That's how we start every single one of these.
Together again, but not always together, because
someone's still complaining.
One of us went to Rocky Mountain, and then my cohort in crime here did not attend.
I couldn't make it. Sorry. This is the life of having two little children and a wife that works. You know, a wife that's very successful and keeps me in the life I'm accustomed to. Yes, I just couldn't make it up.
He had a week planned of massages, and he couldn't separate himself from it.
My feet are not going to massage themselves, ladies and gentlemen. So I wish that was my life. It was more diaper changes and picking up Legos. But
Legos? Is that an actual task that you've
had? I gotta tell you, for parents out there, they know Legos they're a major hazard because they're little and they are sharp. And listen, I'm like, I wear shoes constantly in my house. I sleep with shoes on because I'm afraid I have to go get some water and I'm gonna step on a goddamn Lego. So you got to be careful with those Legos. Parents know what I'm talking about. You single free swinging dick that you are, Mr. Hunter. You
want to know how far out of touch I am? I literally thought you meant picking up Legos from the store. Like, oh, my kid wanted some Legos. I had to go pick some up.
Well, I got to do that too. And let me tell you, Legos aren't cheap. Like toys in general are just cheap, but Legos are not. You go on Amazon Prime, you're like, I want the new Batman Lego. It's like $72. That and American Doll, very expensive. Everything else, cheap.
Really, $72 for like how many pieces?
Dude, there's like, because first of all, there's also like the Star Wars stuff. Like adults collect them. There's like some like insane 30,000 piece Millennium Falcon that's like $2,000 or something. So I mean, they've turned into kind of like models. You know, we used to do models when we were kids, but that's what Legos are now.
Models out of balsa wood.
Yeah,
is that what you're talking about with glue?
Huffing the glue.
Man, they don't like, do they still do that? I want to know.
Yes, they still do it. There's some old person somewhere listening to this going like, I snuffed the glue this morning. I know. I made my B-52. It's going to go up in my Air Force above my bed.
Like the models that hang from the ceiling.
You bet, baby.
Yeah.
I didn't have the patience. You have to have patience to do that kind of stuff. Because you got to take it all apart, and there's a whole thing to it. And I was just like, I think that's why kids love Legos, because you can put it together pretty quickly, at least the simple stuff.
Well, I think what I did was actually model cars. They didn't go anywhere, but it was plastic, and the plastic glue like melted the glue together. It smelled like crazy lemons.
It did, a crazy smell.
And it was in a metal tube.
Did you ever get high on the glue? I never did.
Listen, I sniffed it when I heard you could get high, but it didn't actually get you. It was nothing. Let's be honest.
It was nothing compared to the heroin you were doing. I was like, I don't know why these kids are messing around with this airplane model glue. Have you guys done this heroin? Get to the party quicker, people. What are we doing here?
I feel like if Bryan Beasley had a theme, the Bees had a theme.
What would it be? Drinking and baseball?
No, it'd be a single song. It would be Night Ranger.
Totally.
What
Sister
song?
Christian.
Sister Christian.
And you know what? We just lost Burt Reynolds. And actually, I was reading an interview today with Marky Mark of the Funky Bunch. And Mark Wahlberg was talking about how Burt Reynolds just hated Boogie Nights. He hated it. He didn't get it. And when they were doing the award show circuit, he wouldn't promote the film, which Wahlberg thinks cost him an Oscar, and it probably did because you got to play the game. And I don't know, he had a great quote that I guess like Burt Reynolds at the Golden Globes or something saw him on the red carpet and like put him in a headlock and was like, I don't know why they like this movie, kid, but we're just gonna go with it. It's really I hate hearing that because I love Burt Reynolds in Boogie Nights. It makes me kind of sad to think that he didn't get it or didn't like it, or apparently he was trying to use an Irish accent. And Paul Thomas Anderson, he's only directed one of their films, so he's like, all right, he gave him a few takes and then luckily cut that shit out. Can you imagine them having like an Irish accent for like no reason? It's very weird, but
it's like Keanu Reeves in The Devil's Advocate. Have you heard his accent?
Oh, yeah,
the southern accent he does? Horrific. It's like, ooh, buddy.
And it comes and goes. It's like.
But going back to that, the reason for those non-film aficionados listening is that particular track
that's correct.
Appears in what I would say
one of the most fantastic scenes in the cinema.
It's the most tension building.
So tension.
Insane.
Yeah.
Scenes of any film insane. Ever.
Go watch it. The drug house scene in Boogie Nights at the end. It's fantastic.
The firecrackers.
Oh, it's so good.
They drive me nuts. As an audiophile.
The little Japanese boy. It's so well done.
He's like, what the hell is happening?
Yeah. And and you got Thomas Jane in there as the coked out ringleader trying to pass off baking powder as coke. Great. Albert Molina. Character actor Albert Molina playing the rich guy listening to 99 Luftballons that moves into Sister Christian.
If anybody knows
and Jesse's Girl. God, great soundtrack. Can we just talk about that soundtrack for the whole podcast? God damn.
Was there a shot of a stereo in that?
Yes.
Thing? Do you know what it was?
No idea. Realistic. That's what I'm going to go with. But he talks in length about how he hates how bands... Like I've got to buy their tape, and they put the songs in the order they want to put them in. And he was like, "I'm Mr. Mixtape." So good, wonderful '80s music.
So, on today's podcast,
oh yeah, do you actually talk to someone today? Who do we got?
One of my boys, one of the boys, Vinnie Rossi,
boom,
formerly of Red Wine Audio, now of Vinnie Rossi,
baby,
audio,
Massachusetts native.
All kinds of fun stuff, modular stuff. You can change stuff up, you can swap it up, you can order it up, you can put anything on it, really. Now, got a pair of monos, too. So he's kind of got a fun little arrangement. They look pretty good. They sounded pretty good. I've heard them. And he's a fun guy to talk to. He's down to earth. And I feel like he loves peace after this interview. He loves peace. He wants harmony in life.
Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that at all. You ready?
Bees, should you?
Yeah, let's roll it.
My guest today, Vinnie Rossi, of fame, Red Wine Audio, and now under the name Vinnie Rossi Amplifiers. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Brian.
You are a prolific amplifier maker, and you're based out of what area?
Massachusetts now. Before that, I was in Connecticut when I started.
And you make high-end amplifiers. Has that always been your bread and butter? Have you done anything?
No, amplifiers is part of it. DAX, phono stage preamp, headphone amplifiers as well. And that was the way it was. They were all separates at Red Wine Audio. And then when I transitioned to the Leo product under the Vinnie Rossi brand, it was a modular platform, like a system that you could add what you want and configure it
What was that? What kind of signaled that transition from Red Wine Audio? Why did you switch the branding over?
Yeah, so I started Red Wine at the end of 2004, and after 10 years, I was doing all battery-powered products.
Yeah.
And with the Leo, I decided to do this whole new approach with the ultra capacitors and the modular system. And I just wanted to separate without separating too much because a lot of people got the whole Red Wine Vinnie Rossi connection. Mm-hmm. So I thought, hey, if I just put my name on it instead, it's not like a whole new brand that people don't recognize because they were always working with me and you just want to distinguish the product.
So you were kind of going for a separate product approach, but you wanted to kind of hold it under your name because you had so much equity built into that already, right?
Right.
Why not just leave it as Red Wine Audio?
Well, I was also doing modifications to certain products. Some of it was portable, head-fi related, and some was home audio. And I just wanted to get away from all that because I got so busy with Leo in that direction that I just needed to change it so people would understand it was something new without just changing a product name, but a whole new platform and a way of doing things.
Oh. And this is mostly inspired by the battery kind of design, right? You were pretty like near and dear to having, and for those who don't know, the battery design wasn't just for portable stuff, right? You were talking about battery supplies for large scale 2-channel amplifiers.
Yeah. So when I started in 2005, well, initially they were smaller powered amplifiers, not in terms of current, just in terms of how much wattage we were outputting. I was using lead acid batteries. There's like the little 12-volt gel cell, seal lead acid. Later on, it was lithium iron phosphate. And those, I was stacking up the voltage, using a lot of cells and getting a lot of power. But they were also being used for the DAC, the phono, the preamp stage, tubes, everything.
And what was the inspiration for that? Like, what is the technical takeaway for the consumer in regards to what the battery kind of design was doing for you?
So back then, I wanted to get really clean power and a lot of current behind it without having to have high voltage and power conditioners and things, just getting away from all that. Yeah. So that was the justification behind it, mainly.
In your new designs, have you done something else in that kind of like power conditioning department, or how have your designs changed from that iteration to what you are now, aside from just the battery supply?
Right. So with the Vinnie Rossi brand, I started playing with ultra capacitors, which is a dual layer capacitor based on graphene. Mm-hmm. It's not like an electrolytic, so low voltage, but you got to stack them in series to get the voltage up. And they have a ton of capacity like batteries, but they're electrostatic, so they're quick to charge and could discharge gigantic amounts of current quickly if ever called upon. I mean, you could arc weld with them if you ever needed to. I mean, you could start cars up with them. They use these capacitors for that purpose, where you could pull hundreds of amps.
Okay.
Not that we need that much for this stuff, but it's there. And I thought, well, it lasts a lot longer because they're rated for 1 million cycles of use versus batteries. Even the best ones were at like around 2,000-3,000 cycles at most.
And would it eat up a cycle every time you powered up your amp?
A cycle is defined differently by manufacturers of these batteries or capacitors, but it's mainly full charge and then discharge to where they claim is a full depth of discharge, and then charging it back up. That's the complete cycle. Okay. But most people don't do that, where they just play it all the way down. And then with the Leo, we're not even coming close to discharging it all the way. It was swapping banks. So there are two banks that were in use. One's charging while the other is discharging and disconnected, and then we'd swap between them. So that's how I was doing it with Leo, and that was powering everything in the Leo, from those banks, and then from there regulating down to all the modules separately. So the idea was, with the battery, there was that whole like range anxiety thing, like how many hours can I play? When I'm done playing, how long does it take to charge? What do I do when it's time to replace the battery? What do I, it's became cumbersome. And with the Ultra Cap, you treat it more like any other conventional component. You turn it on and off, and you don't think about it. And you don't need to replace them, at least not for many, many years to even think about that.
Very interesting. So that kind of brings us up to speed on what you've been doing too right now. But I kind of wanted to also ask you about what your journey's been like. Basically, you're in Massachusetts now, but where were you born at?
I was born in Westchester County, New York, Bronxville, not the Bronx, but right north of the Bronx.
So there's a difference. If you're from the Bronx, what's that like? If I say, "Hey, I'm from the Bronx," what does that mean?
So my parents are from the Bronx.
Yeah.
My father's father was a baker. He had a bakery for 30 years in the Bronx. And so they wanted to get, when my sister and I were born, they wanted to get out of the city, and they couldn't afford Westchester County, so we went up to Dutchess County, which is only about, I don't know, say an hour north of the Bronx, and that's where I grew up. So I can't claim that, I'm from the Bronx or,
I was like, because I just thought it was interesting because I'm like, hey, I'm from the Bronx. I feel like I've heard that before.
And my name's Vinny, so everybody associates that, like, or either Jersey or the Bronx. But it's just the
that is actually is that actually a thing that you fend off?
Oh
Like,
yeah,
Vinny from the Bronx.
Yeah, or Vinny from Jersey, and then the whole what's that? The Housewives and all those guys. It's like
they probably didn't help at all.
No, none of that did. But I take it lightly.
That's as much stereotype as I know.
Wait, what about the music, the culture? That gets associated with that.
Is there?
Oh yeah.
I can only think of it as like scenes from an Italian restaurant by Billy Joel.
Okay.
That's
That's like 70s though, right? We were talking about that earlier. We're both Gen X.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting because we're at this audio show, which is, stereotypical old guys that are baby boomers, and we're both not that, so it's kind of fun.
I actually like that a lot about you because I'm here and I'm reporting the news, and I feel like I'm an observer of things. But you're right here in the middle of it. You're doing the things that they're doing, but in a much different way and in a much different kind of coming from a different place.
Right.
Because I think, do you have any type of aspirational designers, or is this something that you've kind of been a grassroots thing from within inside you? Did you like, oh man, I really like this guy's work, or this is my inspiration? Do you have those kind of things?
That's a good question. Pretty much I started out DIYing like a lot of guys did, and being part of that and then doing the modifications. That's how I kind of got started when I was still working full time. I started posting on the forums. I'm from that whole...
Which forum?
I think it was like Audio Asylum back then, and it was about modifications to CD transports. And
those are pretty serious mods, because the ones I'm used to are like cutting the foam out for your headphone, like really easy.
No, I'm talking about the power supply, the analog output stage, the whole thing, right?
But you're down in the
right
down in the
there.
trenches. Yeah, this is not for the light. You're talking about a DIYer that's actually like engineering.
I tried to get the manuals from the companies like Sony, let's say, and they would, if they had the service manual, you could see the whole schematics of the products to know what you're working on.
Really?
Oh yeah.
I wasn't aware.
You needed to, you have to know the circuit before you start playing with it. You could just
change those public information.
Yeah, big companies like Sony and the like.
Why would they do that?
Because they have service contractors that do repairs for them. So they need that manual, and it's like the technical document, how to open it. And then once you open it, it's like, here's our schematics, here's the various boards inside. And it was, really nice to be able to get that.
So you were modding these CD players to begin with?
Initially, yeah.
Like a mod right, how he
exactly.
takes the oppos.
I talked to Dan. I think he started around 2000. He was maybe at least 5 years before me. I came into the picture. I was modding. It was actually lower cost. They usually were like these. We found, I'm trying to think. It was the Toshiba 3950 DVD CD player that you could buy back then for like under $100, and then souping it up to the level where people were comparing it to a really expensive transport DAC, comparison-wise, 10 times the cost, let's say.
And what's the first thing that can be upgraded that's the most beneficial?
Every manufacturer, if they're working at a price point like $100, they're cutting corners in a lot of directions. Yeah. And it's usually bypassing a lot of crap that I didn't like their output stage. Like the first
whole new output stage.
No, it was cool because the first one of the first things I did was actually, it wasn't as sophisticated as you think. It was right off the DAC chip, just feeding it right to the outputs with one cap.
Wow.
Not going through their stage of op amps and everything. It was, tinkering around, trying to just minimize the circuit and seeing what it sounds like, and not trying to have all that complication. But then it became more of like power supply mods and stuff that I don't even get into anymore because it's just time restrictions. But it was a lot of fun. Then I was doing portable players. I actually was the first to do what we called the iMod back in '04, where it was a third and fourth generation iPod, cracking it open and doing a similar type of thing where we bypass the stock output stage and take it was a Wolfson DAC chip, I remember they were using on the fourth generation, and that was their best sounding one. And and people would think initially back then, oh, that's just MP3s, why bother? But they didn't realize, or at least they didn't at the moment, that you could play lossless, Apple lossless or WAV files, or their Apple equivalent of a WAV was AIFF.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just about, it has to be MP3. iTunes was, but you could rip your own music. And that's what got me into that whole, back then ripping music was really new.
Yeah.
From your CD, putting it onto a hard drive, and then listening it off a portable player. And then it became like the Squeezebox Slim devices. It was you remember those products?
I got one of those, yeah.
Oh, yeah, Squeezebox 2 and 3, and then it just...
But that one, the analog outs from the Squeezebox that I got my hands on was not very good, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But the functionality was amazing.
Sure.
But I was like, the analog. So you could take the digital too, but I'm like, these analogs...
We modded the digital and analog, or I back then gave the customer a choice. Do you want it just digital out, just analog, or both? Like, do you want to have modified? It was like a la carte stuff back then.
That also reminds me that I had a Galaxy 3 phone. That's the last Android phone I had. And it also had a Wolfson DAC. And it also sounded pretty good.
Yeah.
And I would take it to the shows. And I would be like, there's amps and there's DACs and all this external stuff. And then I would listen to mine. I'm like, this is not bad. I mean, it's not awesome.
Right.
But it wasn't horrible.
It was portable. And back then it was all about... external headphone amplifiers to go with the iMod. So guys had things like Ray Samuels back then was really hot with his portables, were really good back then. I mean, I think he retired, but when I started out, I met him at one of the Head-Fi shows in Boston, and he was really cool to meet. He was like a legend of his own. Guys like Tile from Inner Fidelity was working with Headroom headphone amplifiers, so that was like a whole other world I got into.
And that was it. It was Tile and Headroom and Ray, and there weren't that many other amp makers for headphones.
The Canon ALO started a few years after that.
But yeah, by the time I got into it, Ken was up and running. But everybody before that was kind of talking about dude, it's just like these. That's it. It was. I'm just saying, it's not like that now.
Right. Oh, now it's a whole other scene.
It's different. It's grown, right?
You go to the Can Jam. It's grown way beyond home audio, I believe. That is the fastest growing segment of audio, in high-end audio, I should say. It's that segment of it, the portable headphone. Even now, the companies making the players, not using headphone amps, but putting them in the player, like the Astel & Kearns, Sony's, the Hi-Fi Man. Those have taken over, and it's a whole other market. It's pretty wild what they've been doing in this small space. Yeah,
and it's come a long ways, and it's just... It's crazy because companies have actually come and gone. I've seen people come in, throw their hand, and be like, "I'm done now."
Yeah, and it's sad because it makes me feel old. Because it's like I haven't been doing this that long. It's been 14 years, but it's like, wait, they're supposed to outlive me, with their company and grow. And it's like, how did that happen?
Yeah, it's just been wild, and it's still kind of the Wild West, I think, in a couple of ways, but in other ways, it's slowly maturing.
Yeah,
I think it's also not helpful that it's a very niche market, and that makes it a little more volatile when it comes to a lot of things. But
right.
I also wanted to ask you, in terms of the old third generation or fourth generation iPods, what was the one thing that showed the most improvement in those mods? Is it just like the headphone amplifier? Oh.
It was just taking that headphone out and converting it into a line out so you could use that headphone amp of your choice and get a good signal to it. And bypassing the amplification, and just using it as a line output like you would with a CD player, let's say, that has its own DAC.
Yeah.
That's what the iPod had in it.
So the main issue for a lot of this was the headphone amplifier was inexpensive.
Yeah, I mean, it was probably pretty good considering its price because it was like a mass-produced item.
But I mean, if you wanted to improve the sound, aside from the price, I'm not saying that you could get vastly better sound if you just get it out of there and get into another system.
That's it.
Yeah, I mean, I was barely around for those click wheels. Is this the click wheel?
It was
generation?
a click wheel, yeah.
Oh.
And the 5th gen I did, and I stopped at the 5th. And then the 6th and beyond, they went with another chip, and it wasn't worth it anymore because you just couldn't you're limited to their choice. The sound of that chip I just wasn't into as much. It didn't have that warmer character that the Wolfson chip had. It became a little more grainy, and at that time, most people wouldn't care. It's an iPod, right?
Yeah.
But for the head-fi community, they did care. They wanted a good source that was portable. This was before the other high-end portable players were on the scene, and then they came out, and then they grew a whole new niche in the market.
So as you're modding these things, do you have another job too?
No, so this is what happened. I had a full-time job, and I stopped at the end of 2004 because I decided, from people asking me, hey, can you mod this on the side for me? I'm scratching my head thinking, hey, I want to do this. This is my in. And if I'm going to try to start my own company doing this full-time, this is what I wanted to do. I just needed to jump in full-time and take the risk.
I've actually seen that quote from a couple of people saying, this one was based on a musician's perspective, I think, but he was like saying, if you really want to be a musician, you got to quit your full-time job.
Yeah. I wasn't going to do I'm going to do this on the side and call it a company. Back then, it was just me for fun, as someone who was just tweaking before I had my own brand, which was Red Wine Audio when I started in beginning of 2005. So I put my notice at the end of 2004 and decided to go forward with that.
And what were you doing?
Okay, so when I started working at a college, I was working for Lucent Technologies. It was the telecom industry, high-speed fiber optic, laser, transmitter, and receiver test sets. So that was like sending things over fiber optic cable, testing those boards that they were using in their products in the telecom industry. So that's my background at a college. Audio was something I was doing beforehand for fun as even a teenager and into college, but not as a business. So I graduated with a double E degree and started working right after then
That's electrical engineering for the common folk.
Yeah, okay.
But
Right.
But people use that phrase. I've heard. But actually, I learned it here because everybody's like double E.
Right.
And I was like, what? It was like electrical engineering. It's
Yeah.
2 E's, and the 2 is the double.
That's right. And there's the IEEE. That's a whole other.
Oh, there's a triple E?
IEEE is a Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers. So that's like a triple E. And so exciting.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
dude, the acronyms and the short abbreviations give you so excited.
Right. So that's what I was doing, and then it was
So at heart, you've always been
electronics
an engineer.
guy. I loved electronics.
Yeah, it's like your thing.
Not so engineering, just electronics. And
What does that mean to you, engineer? Now, there's mechanical, there's chemical, there's bio,
Sure.
and then there's electrical. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that you are... Oh, why not engineer, but always electrical? What is the connotation around an engineer in your mind? That's what
engineer is a really broad type of major. You have to specialize.
Yeah.
So you could take basic engineering, and that's just learning how to, you're applying your physics, your math, and
It's like communication.
Yeah, into making product and filling a need in a void in the market, let's say, or a civil engineer is going to talk about how they built a bridge to, get from one place to the other over water. It's like engineering at its core is designing and producing product to fill a need. That's a real basic definition.
But to you, what part of that does not apply to you, or why are you not?
No, that's my degree, but it's
not who you are.
Yeah, it's more with audio, like with this business. It's a mixture of engineering and also I view it as it's almost like an art where an engineer is going to say, hey, we're doing it right to the T with the measurements and that's what we want. Mm-hmm. It's a real solid engineering design. And, you strive for that, but it's also about how it conveys music and what it makes someone feel like. And you just can't get that out of measurements. And that's maybe a little of a sticky topic for some, measurements versus hearing and, can you measure everything, and the subjectivists versus the objectivists.
Do you measure? Oh, let me ask you one question first. Are you an audiophile?
Yeah.
Okay.
But that has different definitions too, right?
Right. But I mean, in your mind, as the definition that you apply,
oh, definitely,
you're one of the crew.
It's not just about the music; it's the sound. What you're achieving. Anybody could be a music lover and not care so much about how it sounds. But if you're an audiophile, you care about the sound quality that you're hearing through your, with your music. It's not just putting on earbuds and being happy with that.
Yeah.
So that's in my definition. If you are deeply interested also in reproducing the sound of the music, that's audiophile.
And so when you're designing an amp, how do you weigh in measurements? Because let me give you some context. I've done this many times and asked the same question to all types of designers of audio products. Sure. And there have been quotes that have come back and said, well, I've measured this thing, and I measured this amp, specifically this amp, and I measured this amp, and they measured exactly the same, but they sounded completely different from each other. Hence, measurements are worth nothing. Where do you fall in that compared to measurements are everything for those guys? We all know. Where do you fall into that in your belief system? But also, how do you apply it to the way you design your amps? Do you measure your amps?
I do.
Okay.
But it doesn't dictate, the direction I'm going to go if I don't like the way it sounds. Like, for instance, you could apply a ton of feedback and get a cleaner measurement, let's say, but you might not like what it's doing. So measurements, I don't discount them. I think they're important, and at least they could show you some like gross anomalies, like if you have some strange, deviations somewhere that don't make sense, or oscillations, let's say, in an amplifier that you didn't know about at a higher frequency than you could even hear. You still want to, find those and make sure that's taken care of. But it's not going to, tell me the whole picture. It never does. Why is that? I don't know. I think part of it is when you measure with test tones, it's not the same as music, because music is comprised of so many of those test tones all at once, all in different amplitude and phase, so you just can't capture that all. You could get some idea, but there's a lot more going on than just what you're going to capture with measuring equipment. The human ear is still the best equipment we have, I believe, to judge what music sounds like.
Do you think that you could design an amp without measurements?
Anybody could design. Look.
No. A good amp. Can you make a good amp without measurements?
Sure.
In the long, unlimited budget and unlimited timeline.
Oh, yeah. I do. You could, just based on your own two ears, it might not be something that everybody likes the character of, but I think you can make a lot of people happy with it if you work at it and keep listening. But the opposite is you could be completely deaf and make a fantastic measuring amp. You don't need to hear. You just need to, look at your test gear and see how well it measures. And you can make an amp, a totally legit amp, being deaf.
What does that amp sound like in your mind?
I don't know.
So it could vary. Is that that's what I get to? Could the sound of an amp that measures exactly the same, could it sound different, or is it almost always the same type of sound?
No, I think it's going to vary based on
it will vary.
Choices of parts, topology. You could have. Well, I think a lot of designers have found over the years that you could have two amps that measure very closely and still going to deviate when they listen to music. And it, depending on the speaker you're using, will change it. Because when we measure, we typically use, a passive load, like a resistive load. Mm-hmm. A speaker is a lot more complicated because you have this crossover network. Mm-hmm. You have different drivers, a box, a room. What's right? There is no right. There's no best. It's really something that you have to listen to and judge for yourself. That's where I think in this industry, in this hobby, I think the listener needs to decide what's right for them and not just base it on, like for instance, it's the classic stereophile, for instance. Reviewer loves the sound, loves the product. When they go to measure it, John Atkinson will find some anomalies. But the reviewer loved it, and maybe a lot of the customers love it and don't care so much. And some will say, I never heard it, but I looked at those measurements. I wouldn't even touch it because I see that, and it doesn't seem like it was designed properly. So who's right and who's wrong? I say nobody's right and nobody's wrong. It's if you plug it in and you like that sound in your system with your speakers, with your music and your taste, it's right. If you don't, it's wrong. And nothing else is going to tell you the truth.
But surely there's an aspect of definition and non-distortion and linear things that you can measure that'll say, well, I can get this, but maybe it comes out dry on the other end, or lifeless, or no warmth, or whatever adjective you want to use in that scenario. But
I don't want to generalize, but typically, at least in my experience, the better things get to they measure better and better, it tends to sound more
What?
analytical, sterile, but not as much life to it. Like, for
Really?
instance, like guys who, like a lot of audiophiles prefer tube amps.
Yeah.
They don't measure like solid state amps. Like for instance, an SET, single-ended triode amp, no feedback. It's got over 1% distortion, if not higher at times, right? But some people live for that sound. Some listeners will live for that sound and don't care. That's the sound they're looking for. So it's not about what's right or wrong. It's what you like. That's where I view it less like an engineer, more like an artist. When you go to a museum and you look at paintings, are you analyzing a Monet versus Picasso and saying, well, that's wrong and that's right? No, it's just a different style. It's a different approach. And the observer is going to pick, the artist that when they feast their eyes on, say, that piece moves me. When I view that and for a while, that gets me going. And versus maybe a Picasso, they don't like cubism. So they're not going to, enjoy it as much. But it's not that Picasso was wrong and Van Gogh is correct.
I totally agree with that to a certain extent, but I do feel like there's a minimum threshold that needs to be met along those lines.
Oh, if there's like severe distortion and other weird things going on where you're striving for, in the human hearing range at least, a somewhat, fairly flat response, and you're getting some weird deviations, especially in electronics where, you could get that flat fairly easily compared to speakers, which is a lot harder. Yeah, you could say, okay, at one point, what do you say is it broken? Like in terms of like that's a broken measuring piece. I mean, and that's a gray area. And I think some are okay with gray areas in audio, and some it's more black and white.
Is it accurate to say that on an amplifier level, you're looking at things from more of a distortion kind of vantage point, whereas speaker manufacturers have to deal with the frequency response so much more because it's such an imperative variable in their formula?
It's distortion comes into play, but it all comes down to listening. This is my take. I'm not. Don't quote me as like, and this is the gospel. But you need to be happy with what you're listening to, and others might gravitate towards the sound you're creating, and others might not. If they're looking for something that's as accurate as possible, that's a whole other league. That's where they're looking at what's accurate, and that alone. How do you define that? I mean, even before we get to the playback chain, we're talking about in the studio, what's accurate?
Yeah, I mean, let's not forget that, when they talk about frequency response of all the speakers in that, microphones have a frequency response.
But listen, even when in the studio, the choices that the recording engineers make, is that accurate? They're human. We're all human. Are the musicians accurate? They're playing. It's not like a science. So why should this hobby just be considered as treated as a science? It's an art, and even the playback is its own art because you're not going to ever perfectly recreate what was captured with live music to begin with. It's always the minute that sound goes into the microphone, it's changed.
Yes.
I mean, everything imparts a sound signature. Yeah. So, but you could still come out saying, I prefer the recorded sound, through my system than going to see that performer live when I heard them. I mean, for instance, I saw, 2 years ago, do you know Shelby Lynn? Okay. So I remember buying a few Shelby Lynn records, and I'm like, I really like her. I went to see her locally. She was playing it just by chance, and I caught it in the newspaper, what have you. And my wife and I went to see her, and in that venue, which was a small restaurant that was playing her, and their PA system was horrendous. Yeah. And it's like, oh, you don't like accurate venue? No, it wasn't accurate because you weren't just hearing her and her band. You were hearing the awful PA system that made it sound so... I think even she caught on with it and she just started singing like away from the mic, and it was just fine because it was so small, the venue. You didn't need all that. So it got a lot better, the second half of the show, but...
I always kind of felt like the idea of this mirror image of the original, it was so biased towards certain types of music because a lot of the music I was raised on, it's all amplified. Aside from the vocals, the guitars, the bass, the drums. To say that, the recreation should sound like the original is so biased towards stringed instruments and orchestra that I'm like, well, it doesn't make sense because the music I love the most, it's always been amplified. Guitar amps.
Oh, yeah. yeah,
it's skewed
that's the
towards
way you have to do it.
genres
Yeah.
that a lot of the consumers.
All right, if you listen to rock music, you grew up with like Nirvana and the grunge when that started, and the Pixies. I mean, that was a very grungy sound. That's distortion. I mean, it wasn't about you're playing it back now. Do you want that distortion to be changed? Do you want it to be accurate? I mean, what is accurate now?
Yeah.
How much distortion?
And I did a little bit where I was recording a speaker, and some guy was like, "Why did you use a distorted guitar? It's impossible." Like, he was really calling out. I'm like, "Listen," it's like I was in there in the studio when I recorded it because it was me playing the guitar, and the musicians don't really. You could say the engineer has more hand than the musicians, because the musicians for a lot of time play, and they're conscious of the way their stuff sounds, especially guitar players who tinker with all the pedals.
Sure.
But what they're experiencing while they're playing is not the same thing that's in the room. So the idea of the perfect sound or the perfect replication is lost immediately, and the originator of said sound is not even aware of it at the time. There's so many really bad breakdowns of that chain when it comes to like that recreation idea. But I think in this hobby, people just want something definitive to point towards in a lot of things. And the AB guys and the ones who are like really love the testing, it's because the science of the idea is just as important as the idea itself.
Well, science, in its how do I say this? Like in its most basic forms, to me, it's like it's putting things in boxes. You want to defy things, just like, is it this or is it that? And then you break it down. Is that this or that group? That's science. Like, you need to classify things. Yeah, you need to understand what you're doing. You need to be repeatable. Yeah. You want to, and that's important. That's what science is all about. But when it comes to playing music, right? That's more like painting to me. It's an art, and I don't play music, so I'm not talking with the firsthand experience. But to me, it seems like we call them artists because that's what they are. They're not. Their canvas isn't a canvas. It's their instrument and their stage, and from set to set when they're playing, even that changes. It's not the same, and even no two moments are the same. Yeah. So everything is repeatless, and now that we're trying to capture that moment when we record, and play it back, who's to judge what is the accurate, absolute of what it should be? I think it lends itself to what we want it to be at times.
And I really think that part of that thing we were talking about is that they want to understand. The people who demand scientific, look at schematics, are obsessed with specs. They want to compartmentalize the information so they can better understand it to make a decision.
Oh yeah, I mean,
you know what I'm saying? It's like
I get that all the time. Even at the shows, people will ask questions like, for instance, is that a two-way or three-way? Oh, I've heard two ways. I don't like two-way. I heard three-way. I don't like that. But you heard a three-way. Did you hear that three-way? Did you hear that tube amp? Oh, I've heard two-way three tubes. I don't like them. Yeah, you heard a two-way three amp, but they don't all sound the same. I've heard Class D. Class D is terrible. You heard a terrible Class D amp, but how many have you heard? Right? I mean, there's many out there now, and some sound quite good, and some don't.
The sample set of one. It's a very common thing, yeah.
Right. So you get that all the time. And even at these shows that we're at now, like, some people will just walk in real quickly, make a quick judgment. They don't know what they're hearing, but they all of a sudden know what the speaker sounds like, what the whole room, it's terrible. It's like maybe that recording wasn't that good to begin with, but people want to hear that music. So what's the big deal? You got to stick around for a little bit and not just stand by the wall and come in and out and make judgments and then become internet, you're posting on all the forums as if you really knew what you were hearing, and you barely made it past the bathroom of the hotel room where it's all like bassy in there. Come on.
Do you think there's an old saying that I've heard? No, not an old saying. It's maybe new, but do you think that one negative review equals 1,000 positive reviews?
In terms of its magnitude, like how it could be equally damaging as 1,000 positive could be good for you?
Yeah.
Probably. Well, I don't know 1,000, but yeah.
Well, the weight's heavier.
It's definitely.
Because that's kind of what you're getting at, right? These guys come in and they say one negative thing, and it's just like, it's magnified because you could have 1,000 people come in here and say it was great, but if one dude comes in and listens in the bathroom and it says it sucks,
like when I say bathroom, I mean like when you walk into the room first, you pass through the little hallway in the room where it's like all enclosed, and then it's like echoey, and then you finally come into the room, and it's like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Or someone who's standing up against the wall with a head up against the wall, which is the worst place to be, up right next to a wall, where of course the bass is going to be, you're going to have all that reverberation of the room. So, negative things can hurt you, but those that are hearing, if people are listening to what they hear, it's fine. It all comes down to those that listen are going to form their own opinion if they are at that level in the hobby where they are comfortable using their own ears. Now, if they're new and want to hear what others have to say because they're not quite sure, or they don't have an opportunity to ever hear your equipment or come to the shows, of course they want to hear what others have to say to give them an idea, like, should I even consider this? If all of a sudden people are raving about something, they're probably curious. If people are slamming it, they're not going to look into it.
I also think that what people have to say online has a lot to do with their past purchases. People want reassurance that the money they spent was the right choice, so they will base their output online based upon what they've already bought.
Yeah.
So like if someone bought something else that was like, oh, this is way better, they will start voicing their things, not because they actually believe it, because they don't want to feel insecure about the purchases they've made.
Okay, that's pretty a human thing to do. Like we go, like if we're buying something that we're not that familiar with, like if you're not too versed in automobiles and you're looking to make your next automobile purchase, you're going to want to read up on it and see what independent reviewers have to say, car and driver has to say. There's so many ways to look at it. But unless you get your butt in that seat and drive the car, how are you going to know what you like if you feel that way?
Well, yeah, absolutely.
About the car. Like, do you mirror their opinion, or do you have your own opinion about what it feels like?
And but even more than just driving a car, this hobby has a really intangible quality to it that you're definitely on. It's like, what does good sound like is way, I think, more obscure than, I drive in this car and it was awesome.
Yep.
You know what I mean? It's not a lot, but a little bit more out there.
There's so many controversial topics in high-end audio, it seems like, from cables to tweaks and, doodads in the room, like, different brands making these little pucks and platforms and things. And some people get really aggravated by things like cable, saying, how dare you scam us like that? My view is, if the company sells a cable, for instance, and they have a money back, some type of return policy, no matter what they're asking for the money, if the buyer is happy and to them they hear it, whether they're imagining it or not, you don't need to start, attacking them. If they hear it and they're happy, then they're happy, and leave them alone. Now, if they're not happy and they can't get their money back, then maybe they have something to complain about. But let the product do what's talking to the user, and not everybody hears the differences for things like cables or whatever it is, any tweak of whatever flavor of the year. But that's really up to the end user to decide what they like.
Just for the record, have you heard the differences in cables?
Yeah. It's funny because sometimes you could have, for instance, a customer who over the years hasn't bothered to, most people don't go to clean their binding posts, their speaker posts, or their RCA jacks or whatever. So they're filled with crud and dust and grime. Now, let's say that happened for 5 years, and then they finally decided to change their speaker cable. They pull the cable out. By doing so, they lifted a oxidation and crud out of there, put the new one in. All of a sudden, it sounds better because they reduced the impedance by 50 ohms, let's say, of junk, and it sounds better. It did sound better, but now there's so many other factors besides the cable, like the actual interface where the connectors are and stuff. So, and it could just be like your mood at the time when you're evaluating.
Yeah.
If you had a crappy day, you're probably, maybe not in the mood to be doing that type of evaluation where you're critically listening. You just want to, wind down and enjoy music and not think about it. But when you're in the right moment and you do that, you might be able to hear things better.
I just want to ask one quick question that you threw out there. Are you saying that crud in the connector can affect the impedance?
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you have, ideally you have 0 ohms, right?
Yeah.
But nothing has that. The more, whatever's on that connector, if it's grease, grime, oxidation, that's going to change it. Like, for instance, raw copper will oxidize and it'll get green.
That's why everything's pseudo gold plated.
Yeah, that's the reason. There are certain, sprays and things you could keep them clean. I have one of our products is the directly heated triode preamp, and those tube sockets. When people roll tubes, they're buying NOS tubes that may be from the wartime, World War II, where those pins on those tubes, they're pretty cruddy. If they're not bothering to scrape that off, clean it, they're going to stick it into the tube socket and switch tubes. And they're all slightly different diameters on those pins that stretch it out and change it. People have a lost channel. We're saying, I lost my sound. Well, did you tighten it up? Did you clean it? And then that's usually will solve it. So for instance, so it could go from barely making a difference to losing a channel if it's really bad.
Wow.
So it counts. It all counts.
Well, I just know that from a lot of takeaways on the headphone amplifiers that one of the feature sets is always to try to get it down, the impedance down to, like you said, close to 0 or less than 1.
Of the headphone output, you're saying?
The headphone output.
Yeah.
Are you saying that number is affected by how dirty the jack is as well? Or am I misconstruing?
I'm talking like severe cases where...
Yeah, but even if there's a lot of crud, the impedance number goes up.
Yeah. Well, resistance, at least resistance. I don't know about inductance and capacitance. That's, you could... I've had bad connections I've measured where you'll see and you'll find that, you're debugging, helping somebody, and you find like a cold solder joint.
Yeah.
Or just a dirty connection, sure.
Well, I guess what I'm getting to is the signal binary, or will sound quality be affected by this like a really dirty connection? Is it on or off, or can you sense a deterioration of the quality?
Talking about when you're measuring it, when you're listening to it?
When you're listening to it. So for all the listeners out there who are all of a sudden start experiencing some it's not sounding as good as it used to, is it possible that there's a dirty connection somewhere?
Very possible, and it happens often. Or the cable, let's say, has been flexed back and forth where inside that interface where the solder and the connector meet, it's getting pretty weak and it's hanging by a thread. Yeah. And you don't know that because you have all this wrap over it, so you don't really know what's in there, what's going on. It could be like one strand of copper. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but yeah, that is going to play a big role on what you're...
Before it breaks, it's going to sound like crap? Is it or sound worse than it could be?
I would think would sound worse, but again, maybe that extra impedance, someone likes that better.
Yeah.
Like a transformer output tube amp has a typically higher output impedance than a solid state. That's called damping factor when you take the ratio, okay?
Well, that's the argument for the impedance is that they want, the theory is right, for at least for headphones, that the damping factor comes into effect when you don't have, you have a low impedance on the amplifier end and super high. There's like a 2-time ratio or something. I read
factor of 10 is like the...
Yeah, the factor of 10.
At least.
Sorry. Yeah.
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 So that comes into play because the headphone or the speaker, when you see measurements of that, and this is where measurements are useful. You want to know some of these things, like, okay, this speaker varies throughout its audio band and its measured impedance, on the input terminals significantly. So if your amplifier has a fairly high-ish output impedance as well, you could expect that the total result is going to have peaks and dips, based on that. So it all comes into play. You want to know what's going on there.
Yeah.
So again, I'm not saying forget measurements. You want them as a baseline, but to use them only as your basis for deciding if something's good or not without listening is a foolish mistake in my opinion. Yeah. And so don't just base it on if the measurements are really good, you're going to be happy with it, or if they're really bad or not good enough, you're not going to enjoy it, because that might not be the case.
Spoken like a true form reader. I mean, you're touching on these things that are what I've been told are called the classic audiophile conversations. They're not arguments; they're conversations.
Yeah. Conversation points. Of
and,
note.
And how much text, how many pixels have been spilled?
Oh, digital versus analog.
Well,
you have every debate, because just like society itself, we're always debating this or that, political parties, religion, race, gender, analog, digital. It seems like the thing where you're divided so many different ways, and you have to sit back and just take a deep breath and say, like, what is this really all about? Well, it better be with this hobby, this enjoyment. This hobby should be all about enjoyment. If you're not having fun and you find yourself bickering on forums, all the time, if that's your way of whatever releasing stress, that's kind of sad because the whole point of this is to have fun with it. And if someone has a way different opinion of you or prefers a amplifier or a speaker or a headphone more than you liked it, keep in mind their shape of their ear, the shape of their head, their brain waves, it might be a little different than yours. So it doesn't mean that they're wrong. You just didn't agree with what you liked, and that's okay because, again, you might not like Picasso versus Van Gogh or Michelangelo, but it's okay. It's not about right or wrong.
Do you think that other hobbies suffer the same type of dynamic?
Yeah.
Or that this one suffers it a little bit more?
I think this suffers it maybe a little more than others, but it's not the only one like it. Motorheads are going to say, your engine needs to be like this, or your style car, or your motorcycle, or even like wine connoisseurs are going to argue about,
The grapes.
the grapes and the aroma and everything about it because they're passionate about it. And when you're passionate about something, you could get a little too passionate if you take it like a religion where you're so into it where, you put all your heart and soul to that level where you step beyond enjoyment. And I see that happen a lot. And I kind of step back and be like, all right, let them have it at it because that's what they want to do, but I think it's really sad.
I wouldn't say that it's
when you get to the point where you're
really
at odds, where you're really upset with somebody and you're having like big feuds and it gets so ugly.
Yeah.
Now, if you just have a passionate like discussion where you're arguing, but not to the point where you're like, I've heard of cases where people have broken out into fights over these type of things.
over like a classic audiophile conversation.
Yeah.
A fight over an AB or a.
I've heard stories from people who've told me these things at certain, I won't get
The first thing I'd say to that is most of the guys that argue on the audiophile subjects are sweethearts in person. They're animals when they can, hide behind a
screen.
keyboard.
Yeah.
But when you see them in person, so for them to actually go fisticuffs is awesome, and I would be rooting for whoever. I'd just be like, oh my god, because the thing is, hiding behind the keyboard. That's fine. If that's your life and that's what you want to do, but to like raise that to the physical level, that is so unaudiophile in my opinion.
Unaudiophile. Now we're talking, are we doing, audio, we're doing MMA, or boxing or something. It becomes something else.
I just can't see, I know there's fights, but I can't see two audiophiles duking it out. The reviewers, of course.
So do you have a comment section when you post your podcast? Because I'm sure people are going to chime in with, their stories because it's happened.
I've only heard of a fight at a show a couple of times, and it's the same stories that everybody has. I've never heard of two audiophiles duking out over what you're saying, this scenario, and I am massively interested.
Like getting in their faces to the point where like it's going to escalate. No, maybe alcohol is involved. We didn't talk about the alcohol factor. But when you add it all together and you stir the pot, you'd be surprised what that stew is going to taste like. It could get really ugly.
It's not that I don't think it could happen. It's just that from my experience, everybody is so I'm big and tough behind the keyboard. In real life, they're not. So to have two guys actually like level it up to the point where they come to blows would just simply be a thing to behold. I would be like, dude,
someone's gonna one day have it. On video.
Not that I want.
It's going to get uploaded, and they're going to contact you to sell you that footage.
And I would buy it.
And you're gonna try to send that out everywhere and then social media.
And listen, guys, I do not agree with physical violence. I'm only saying that this scenario is like crazy. But there has been fights. There have been fights at this, at audio shows where these guys get together, but it's a lot about ego. It's a lot about too much booze. In a sober situation at, let's say, 9:45, there's no physical violence to be held.
Right.
If everybody's in a calm state.
Yeah.
You do this combination quite a bit. Let's talk about what you usually run with. He does something a little different in his showrooms. He runs a gamut of this near field, generally speaking, studio monitor style speaker, but he always carries a couple of models. The big ones to smalls, sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 3. it's not across the room. You're sitting and the shit is angled towards your ears. Always.
Not always, but closer. Depending, it's really about the room. Because every hotel I go to at these shows, typically it's the standard size room, and it's not that big.
But you run it the opposite way everybody else does. They run it the long way. You always run it the short way.
A lot of shows I actually run diagonal.
Diagonal.
Yeah, it's called kitty corner, I don't know, something like that. Or I just say diagonal, where you are facing into a corner from a distance. So you're trying to break up standing waves is what you're doing, with bass especially.
And I can see that you have some stuff set up for the first point of reflection, too.
Trying to capture that a little. It's really about, with the near field, what you want to do is get the room more out of the equation. So by doing so, you're trying to pull away from the room boundaries. And if you have more toe in so that it's kind of hitting your ears, the sound waves are hitting your ears much more in advance than the reflections are. Mm-hmm. That's where we start to say near field. So you're hearing less room. I think the room itself is at least half of what you're hearing, 50% of the total sound, sometimes even more. If you've seen, and again, measurements come in handy when you measure a room. You could see what the room is doing in terms of peaks and nulls, areas of intense boost and areas where sound is being canceled because the reflection comes back out of phase. That takes away. That's destructive interference is the physics term, or constructive interference where you get a boost. And as you walk from front to back, towards or away from the speakers, playing something with, a bass track, you're going to hear points where it's really strong or like almost where the bass kind of gets weak. So you want to work that when you're setting up a room and trying to get it to sound balanced. At a show, you don't want to have just one chair where one person is going to be real happy and everybody else is like, I don't get it. Because they're not really hearing much of the sound because it's, so near field.
Yeah.
And they can't sit down and enjoy it. But when I tried setting up the long way initially, so you could get more seats, it was just the seats in the back maybe were too boomy or too thin. I forgot with this room how it was, but it was a lot of variation. So you want to minimize it, but without getting to the point where you're catering to one listener where only the sweet spot sounds right and the rest is pretty bad. Unless, I'm talking about a show. At home, if you're just listening on your own, that's your thing. If you're listening with others, you just don't want to have it for one person. Unless you're a headphone guy and it's all about you.
Yeah. Well, I do have a kind of a love for the near field listening just because I spend a lot of time at my desk and I like the big room and I love sharing music. But when it's like honed in, just like right there in front of you, I think there's a certain magic that you can find as you tweak the angle. Yeah. When it's coming, it's not, for me, it's not always been direct. As you go that angle, you can hear the augmentation so well. And it's a magical little thing where you're like, ooh, it's going wider. It's going closer. And then you hit it.
That's it. And now someone might ask, well, what is that spot? Every speaker, it's different because they have different drivers, different tweeters. They have different properties. Okay, so it might not work the same way. Distances, you have to play. When you come into as a hobbyist with audio, you have to want to play. Not just play the music, but play around with setup. Take the time, give it a chance, different ways. Come back to the way you maybe started with. Draw your own conclusions, because without doing so, if you just plop the speakers in the room and say, okay, I'm done, you're only hearing it one way.
Yeah.
You might love it, but you might be curious to try, say, well, what happens when I do this or that? That's how I got into near field. I forgot, but when maybe I was walking up to the rack to change something and the music was still playing and I maybe stopped because I dropped something and then I put my head down and I lifted my head up and it's like, at that moment, at that spot, it's like, I was like, wow, what's going on here? I didn't capture that because I was always sitting maybe over there. So when you start to open your mind to trying different ways to position speakers and in your room, if you have that luxury to do so, where you can give it a shot, because you're only wasting time if it doesn't work out. You're not wasting money.
Yeah. The quality of the room. I have a couple of different textures in my house, and I have a wood paneled den.
Wood panel den. What is it? The 70s, the 80s.
Absolutely, it was made in the 70s.
Okay.
And it's gorgeous. It sounds way different than your typical drywall with paint on it. It is like uniquely different.
Hardwood versus drywall is much different.
Yeah, and
carpet versus hardwood or concrete, it all changes.
Well, the place in Chicago that I had, it was all glass, and it was the reverb was so. It's just so hard to find a unique focus, a unique placement with that. It's just like everything's coming from everywhere, all over, and it's just whoa.
So that becomes the opposite of near field when you have so much reflections coming into play where your ear, the first thing it's hearing is timed very closely to all the reflections so that your brain can't piece it together well, and it gets confusing and blurred and not just bright, but it just becomes a mess.
Yeah.
Or you could have it set up well, but you could be in a room at a certain size, and then when you get to a certain volume and beyond, the room can't contain it because you're getting reflections that are becoming more prevalent that they weren't there before at a lower volume. So the room is starting to break up, I say, even though the room's just vibrating with the music. But then that comes into play. So there's a lot of factors. Talking about sound waves, they're all this, different frequencies, but the human mind is, I think, from evolution, we're brought up to really hone in on voice because that's how we survived, by communicating and listening for trouble, right? So you're going to hear that mid-range more than you're going to hear the bass in the top end because the human ear is not a linear response. It's quite logarithmic, So the ear doesn't even measure perfectly flat. It's not supposed to. Certain frequencies that we hear are boosted, but our brain calibrates that, okay? But we tend to pick up on the mid-range more. So there was a common feature, not so much now in high-end audio, but years ago, called a loudness knob. Yeah. Now, loudness knob wasn't volume. Loudness was a way in which you would alter usually increasing the bass and treble together, or a certain ratio of them, such that at low listening volumes, it kind of replenished what was taken away. What gets taken away at such low volumes through speakers. So people who maybe your listener was looking for late night listening and just sounded like you were saying, it's low, but I don't hear the bass anymore. That was supposed to correct for that. But I'd rather just listen at the volume I want to listen to. And if it's too late and you're disturbing people, well, you have tomorrow, okay? I'm not, but everybody wants a different thing.
Or headphones, let's be honest.
Listen to headphones. Now, headphones versus home audio is another one of those, debates. And
well, being from both sides of the thing, do you think there's some disrespect shown to the headphone guys from the classic 2-channel guys? Like, it's not really the hobby.
No, I think it's just a different way of listening because with headphones, the sound is coming more like it's coming from in your head. Yeah. There's binaural recordings that kind of expand it, but you don't get that in front center image like you're watching performers on stage, where you can when you have speakers in front. A lot of guys confuse near field. They're like, isn't near field like if you're going that close, just like giant headphones? I'm like, not quite. It's like headphones in that you're illuminating a lot of the room, but the image, if you do it right, is way out beyond the speakers in front, and you're getting that layering that with headphones, it's still in your head. Yeah. And
also panned, it's so left and so right, and not in front is what I notice.
And so headphones listening is very different. And it's not. It's a different way. In some ways, headphones are more ideal because there is no room, and you could really get some serious bass if you want that, for instance, or a sound that without the room getting in the equation, you get to hear what that headphone driver sounds like, for better or worse, more than I've heard those speakers before. I didn't like them, but in that room you didn't like them. Maybe you liked them when they were set up differently in that room. But headphones, as long as the people around you, it's quiet enough, you're going to hear exactly what they're supposed to sound like.
In those terms, do you think that it's possible that headphones are capable of higher definition, purely definition, not this organic, warm sense of reality, but just on terms of pure definition, without the room and the fact that the driver is less than an inch from your ear? is the definition capabilities of a headphone greater than the possibilities for a speaker?
It has the potentiality to be, but not necessarily it is the case, because headphone drivers have their imperfections just like speakers. So you want to believe that, and the room does get taken out, but there's also many imperfections within headphone listening, just like we get with home audio, with loudspeakers. So I don't want to say that it's going to be better. It could be, but with certain systems in home audio, you might find that they, do a lot better with that aspect. Just getting that resolution. You could still unravel music with home audio in ways that some headphones can't even touch, and vice versa with some really good headphones. Like, for instance, electrostatic Stax headphones, they could really resolve. They're some of the best for that. But it's still in your head. Yeah. And
well, I think to me that's really the defining factor, is that for a cheaper price point, you can get a higher definition. But what the con is that you lose a lot of realism. Loudspeakers are not real. It's still recreation. But at least it's outside of your head. The idea of putting two drivers right next to your ears is so artificial that you really lose a lot of...
You lose a lot of realism unless you're someone working in the studio, always using headphones to monitor the performers. Then that's real to you. So our definition of what's real is... It's still real. It's just a different presentation of real.
Yeah.
So, it's just different.
Yeah. Do you... Well,
I like the philosophy in audio.
I find that interesting because you kind of have, I think, a better grasp on the consciousness of the forums than most. Like,
I'm there all the time. I've been there.
I'm sorry,
I
but
have my own
seems like
forum. On audiocircle.com, I have my own manufacturer's forum.
Yeah.
There's quite a few different manufacturers there. Electronic speakers, room treatment, they're there. And I've been on forums since I started, even before I started my business, just as a hobbyist. So I know the whole forum thing. I've seen the good, the bad,
Well, I can just say, of all the people I've interviewed, you seem to be tapped into that consciousness more than anybody else. You really know. I mean, you seem like a guy who goes on the forums. And
and
it's part of
Facebook
it.
now.
Yeah.
It's another sect of that where people are discussing audio on their own user groups in Facebook. There's a few Harbeth groups on Facebook. Many speakers have this now.
You mean the Facebook groups?
Facebook groups that customers, let's say, will start. And Harbeth has one that's not Harbeth the company, but a Harbeth group, where people discuss, hey, which Harbeth are you using, how are you setting them up, what amp do you like? Yeah. And it's just another... it's chock full of opinions, like anywhere else, and you could take them into consideration. But until you try, you're just listening to someone else's opinion who might have way different ears than you.
You know what the particular kind of interesting thing I think is that there are a lot of these groups, and there's a lot of I do contribute to some of these groups that you're talking about, and the general audiophile ones. The one difference from the other forum is that people leave, and when they leave, sometimes they'll do a huge exit. I am leaving this group because you guys argue too much, or someone was mean to me, and they actually made
you guys are too subjective, you're too objective, you're too analog, you're too digital.
Because there's so many groups, they can leave one and go to the next one and do the same thing. But I saw this video, it was so precious, it was basically a metaphor. It said, if people left a party the way they leave a Facebook group. It was a guy who's saying, I'm leaving this party right now. I've thoroughly enjoyed your conversation, but I can't stand this, and this.
Hey,
it's just ridiculous.
Some people, when you go, they want to go out with a bang.
They want to go with a bang.
I
think that, and I'm not trying to be too harsh on these guys, but I do think that part of it is attention. When you see the most outlandish stuff, I do feel like sometimes there's like, why would you leave a party that you didn't want to be at with a big exit?
Maybe it wasn't working for them.
But why say something instead of just leaving?
Well,
'cause you want those people to fucking know that you're pissed.
Right. That's it. I mean, your feelings are hurt, your ego's hurt, and you don't want to just leave quietly because you're wounded at that moment and you want to, make a bang.
Yeah.
without physically hurting somebody, or hopefully not emotionally hurting. You're just saying, screw you guys all. I'm tired of this, and I'm out of here.
I think you meant to say, "Screw you guys, I'm going home."
Yeah.
I felt like that was what you're going for.
That's what I was thinking, actually.
Because that's what you were saying. The words. I was like, he's gonna. Oh no. Yeah, that's what he meant.
Screw you guys, I'm going home. Yeah.
Bake me some pie.
And that's okay to say I'm going home. If you're not having fun anymore, then you should leave. Because why are you wasting your time? And if other people aren't being, having a good time anymore, then it's with these forums, it should be fun. And you should be learning, but being mindful that people hear things and prefer things that are different, and stop viewing everything as right and wrong, and it's really gray. It's not black and white, it's all gray, and be okay with gray. So I find many times you'll read or hear people asking, in this hobby, this market as a whole, why is it that it seems like it's not growing, it's dying, or it's what's going on there? And I think part of it is because there is a lot of division within it, where people want to be right and they have a hard time accepting that to certain listeners, they're hearing things differently, and they're in different rooms and have different tastes. And that's why you don't go to war on a forum, for instance, over which you're hearing, because it's so different than what maybe someone else is.
Yeah.
I think I've been hitting on that whole concept tonight a lot, and that's what I see. And I think that's what hurts the industry as a whole, because it's trying to divide. And maybe it's because, we were talking about maybe in marketing, it's intentional in some regards, where you want one to be the way, and this is the one that's going to, in a hobby like this, I think it's just damaging. And if you can't accept the fact that, if someone can't accept that we all have different tastes and opinions of what sounds good, and that changes, because I'm sure mine has over the years. What I thought was good sound 10 years ago, I probably could look back and say, I don't like that so much anymore. My taste has changed. Our taste buds changed. When I was a kid, I didn't like certain foods. I hated black coffee when I was younger. I drink it every morning like I need it. It's like, and I love the taste of different types of black coffee without the sugar and milk. Back then, I had tons of sugar and milk. Now I try sugar and milk in a coffee. It's disgusting to me. So it's like my tastes have changed. People's tastes in sound change too, and what they view with their eyes. All your senses change.
Almost everything from my youth that I had with distaste, very young, in terms of food, has changed. I mean, I've been trying I'm actually coming full circle with a lot of the stuff, saying, man, maybe I should try this thing. I never liked it, and I didn't try this thing. And all of it's like, I think you just get, it's not just that it changes, it's that the things that are familiar to you that are similar, they get tired and you look for fresh. Trying something new.
Upgrade-itis.
Yeah, upgrade-itis. Trying something new, listening to something new, getting away from your everyday is fresh.
Yeah, but isn't that a kick, though? I mean,
I think it is.
That's why we live. I mean, the purpose of life is to live and to try different things, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. And that's why some people want to keep changing their system, and they're hunting or playing around because they're just curious, like, what is that like? And maybe this is going to satisfy me for a while, and maybe you get too used to it and you just want to go a different direction. And isn't that cool that we're not all making the same stuff, that we're all not making the same speakers the same way, or the electronics, or digital and analog. Isn't that great that there's so much variety, though, that it doesn't become monotonous? That would grow old so quickly if there was not much variation of this theme.
Yeah, dude. Diversity is good, man. Diversity is good.
Different points of view, and just you get with different wavelengths. In your mind, I mean, like just things you gravitate towards. It's going to change, and that's okay. Very
cool. Well, hey, you want a chance to talk about what you're working on these days, real quick?
Just website.
Well, that's the first.
No.
Listen, go to the website.
Yeah.
That's all. What's the website, at least?
VinnieRossi.com. VinnieRossi.com. That's the best way you could get a quick idea of what's going on, what I'm working on. And then there's a link to the forum, and we were talking about forums. I have a manufacturer's forum on Audio Circle, and a lot of customers and potentially interested people are going there and posting questions, and you can learn a lot. and gravitate to other forums in that audiocircle.com or others and learn a lot of different things and have fun with it.
Hey, man, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.
All right, Brian. Take care.